Elena Voss heard her own name spoken like a piece of property, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She had come to the east wing of the great hall to find a lost hairpin, nothing more, and instead she found the truth standing behind a half-closed door. Two voices. One belonged to Damien Cross, the Alpha King she was set to marry at sunrise. The other belonged to a man she did not recognize, a messenger from a neighboring pack wrapped in a traveling cloak still damp from the road. The northern pack will send 300 warriors the moment the paper is signed, the messenger said. Their Alpha's daughter becomes your second mate, and you gain the strongest army in the region. Everyone wins. And the girl I am marrying tomorrow, Damien said, his voice flat and businesslike. She will understand. She has to. A kingdom cannot survive on love alone. Elena pressed her hand against the cold stone wall to keep herself standing. She had spent 3 years believing that Damien loved her, that the bond between them was rare and true, the kind old wolves spoke about in stories told by firelight. She had believed it enough to give up her own pack, her own name, her own future, just to stand beside him. She will be given a title, Damien continued, a comfortable life she will want for nothing. Except a husband who chose her first, Elena whispered to herself, so quietly that even her wolf hearing barely caught the sound of her own broken voice. She backed away from the door before either man could sense her presence, moving through the corridor like a shadow, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the whole castle could hear it. She did not cry. She had promised herself long ago that she would never let anyone see her cry over something she could not control. Instead, she walked. She walked past the kitchens where servants were already preparing the wedding feast, past the courtyard where banners bearing her family crest hung beside Damien's, past the chapel where flowers were being arranged for a ceremony that would now never take place, not the way everyone believed. By the time she reached her chamber, her mind was clear in a way it had never been before. Grief has a strange power. It can either shatter a person completely, or it can burn away everything soft and leave only steel behind. For Elena, in that moment, it was the second. She changed out of her silk robe and into simple traveling clothes, plain wool and leather, nothing that would mark her as royalty. She took only what she needed. A small bag of coins she had saved over the years without telling anyone why, a knife her father had given her before he died, and the torn edge of the wedding veil she had been fitted for only days before, which she left folded neatly on her pillow, a message without words. The guards at the outer gate knew her well and let her pass without question, assuming she was going to the healer's cottage, as she sometimes did at night, to help with difficult births among the pack's younger mothers. No one thought to stop the future queen. No one imagined she would simply walk into the dark forest and keep walking until the castle lights disappeared behind the trees. She shifted into her wolf form once she was deep enough among the pines, and she ran. She ran until her paws bled against frozen ground, until her lungs burned, until the howls of the night creatures around her became the only sound in the world. She ran away from a crown she no longer wanted, away from a man who had already given away her future without asking her opinion, away from every promise that had turned out to be nothing more than convenient words. By dawn, she had crossed into territory that belonged to no pack she recognized. The trees here were different, older, and the air carried a scent she had never known before. Cold stone and distant mountains. She had no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between herself and the life she was fleeing. Exhaustion finally caught her near a frozen stream. She shifted back into her human form, too tired to keep running, and sat with her back against a boulder, staring at her own reflection in the icy water. She looked like a stranger. Hollow eyes, wind-burned cheeks, hair tangled with leaves and frost. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. "You are still breathing," she told her reflection. "That is enough for today." She did not know yet that this frozen stream marked the border of a kingdom ruled by a man named Alaric Thorn, a solitary monarch whose lands had no history of conflict with the wolf packs to the south. She did not know that her decision to run in this particular direction, made in a moment of blind grief with no real destination in mind, would eventually reshape the rest of her life. Back at the castle, chaos was only beginning. The wedding veil was discovered just after sunrise by a young maid who had come to help Elena prepare for the ceremony. The girl's scream echoed through the halls, and within minutes the entire castle knew that the bride had vanished. Servants whispered among themselves. Guards searched every room, every tower, every hidden passage they knew of, finding nothing but an empty chamber and a folded piece of torn lace. Damien was informed while he was still dressing for the ceremony, still practicing the words of his vows in front of a mirror. When the news reached him, he did not believe it at first. He laughed, actually laughed, certain it was some kind of misunderstanding, that Elena had simply gone for an early morning walk as she sometimes did when she was nervous. But as the hours passed and no trace of her was found, laughter turned to disbelief, and disbelief turned to something colder and far more dangerous. Damien tore through the castle himself, questioning every guard, every servant, every advisor who might know something. No one had answers. The gate guards admitted they had let her pass, assuming she had permission, assuming nothing was wrong. Tracker sent. Damien ordered his best trackers, men who had never failed to find anything they hunted. She cannot have gone far. Find her before the sun sets. The trackers followed her trail to the edge of the forest, then further, deep into territory the pack rarely entered. But somewhere near the frozen stream, her scent simply vanished, swallowed by falling snow and the strange, unfamiliar magic that lingered at the borders of Alaric Thorne's kingdom. The trackers returned empty-handed, faces pale, unwilling to explain exactly how a trail could disappear so completely. Damien refused to accept it. He organized search parties that stretched for miles in every direction. He sent messengers to allied packs, asking if anyone had seen a young woman traveling alone, offering rewards for any information. Weeks turned into months, and still there was nothing. No sightings. No rumors. No trace of the woman who had once been his entire future. The Northern Alliance he had worked so hard to arrange collapsed within the first month. The messenger's Alpha, withdrawing support once word spread that Damien's own intended bride had fled the night before their wedding. Whispers began to circulate through every pack in the region. Some said Elena had discovered something terrible about Damien, and chosen to run rather than marry a monster. Others said she had simply lost her mind under the pressure of becoming queen. A few, the cruelest of all, suggested that Damien himself had done something unforgivable to drive her away, though no one could say exactly what. Damien heard every version of every rumor, and none of them mattered as much as the silence that had replaced Elena's presence in his life. He had grown up believing that fated mates were unbreakable, that the bond between them would always lead him back to her no matter the distance. Yet months passed, and the bond remained strangely quiet, as though she had found a way to shield herself from him entirely. He stopped sleeping properly. He stopped eating regular meals. His advisors grew concerned as the once confident Alpha King began spending hours alone in his study, staring at maps of neighboring territories, searching for any clue he might have missed. His warriors whispered among themselves that their king had lost more than a bride. He had lost himself. She is gone, his closest advisor finally told him one evening, nearly a year after her disappearance. You must accept this and move forward. The kingdom needs stability. It needs an heir. It needs a king who is present, not a ghost chasing shadows. Damien did not answer. He simply stared out the window toward the dark tree line in the distance, the same forest Elena had disappeared into, wondering if she was still alive somewhere beyond it, and if she ever thought of him at all. What he could not have known, what none of his trackers or spies or desperate searches ever revealed, was that Elena had survived that first freezing night by the stream. A patrol from Alaric Thorne's kingdom had found her nearly unconscious from cold and exhaustion, and rather than turning her away or reporting her to neighboring authorities, they had done something she never expected. They brought her before their king. Alaric Thorne was nothing like the stories she had heard about him in passing. A distant ruler known mostly for keeping his kingdom separate from the constant politics and power struggles of the wolf packs. When she was brought into his hall, shivering and barely able to stand, he did not ask who she was or where she came from. He simply ordered warm blankets and food, and told his guards to give her privacy to recover. It would be days before Elena spoke a single word to anyone in that castle. And it would be much longer before she told anyone, even herself, the full truth of what she had left behind. For now, she was simply a woman without a name, sitting quietly in a warm room, watching snow fall outside a window in a kingdom that had no idea she had once worn a crown that was never truly hers to keep. The healer who tended her during those first days was an older woman named Margaret, patient and kind, who noticed the way Elena flinched whenever anyone raised their voice, the way her eyes darted toward the door whenever footsteps approached. Margaret said nothing about these observations directly, choosing instead to simply sit beside her patient each evening, speaking softly about ordinary things, the weather, the herbs growing in the castle garden, small comforts that asked nothing in return. You do not have to explain yourself to me, Margaret told her one night, noticing the haunted look that crossed Elena's face whenever sleep threatened to pull her under. Whatever chased you into that forest, child, it does not follow you here unless you allow it to. Elena did not answer, but she remembered those words long after Margaret had left the room, turning them over in her mind like a stone worn smooth by a river. She thought of Damien's voice discussing her future as though she were a piece on a game board, and she thought of the strange kindness of strangers who asked for nothing except her recovery. Word eventually reached the healer's cottage that the castle's quiet, unnamed guest had begun to speak, softly at first, mostly to Margaret, answering simple questions about her comfort and her needs. She did not speak of where she came from. She did not speak of who she had been. But slowly, day by day, the silence that had wrapped around her like a second skin began to loosen its grip, just enough to let her breathe. Meanwhile, far to the south, the search parties Damien had dispatched combed through territories that bordered his own, questioning travelers, offering rewards, following every rumor no matter how faint. None of them thought to search as far north as the neutral kingdom where Elena had collapsed, for such a distance seemed impossible for someone traveling alone and injured to have crossed in a single night. They did not yet understand the desperate strength that grief and betrayal could summon in a person determined never to be found again. Damien Cross stood at the edge of the frozen stream exactly 1 year after Elena vanished, staring at water that had long since thawed and refrozen many times since that night, as though the ice itself might still hold some memory of her passing. He had returned to this spot more times than he could count, always alone, always at night, when no one from his court could see the desperation on his face. His trackers had told him months ago that any scent trail this far from the castle would be impossible to follow, that nature itself had erased whatever path she had taken. Still he came back, again and again, unable to accept that a person could simply disappear from the world without leaving something behind. "You should not be out here without an escort," a voice said behind him. Damien turned to find Cassia, his younger sister, wrapped in a heavy fur cloak, her breath visible in the cold night air. She had always been the one person in his family willing to speak to him honestly, even when the truth was uncomfortable. "I needed air," Damien said. "You needed her," Cassia corrected gently. "There is a difference, brother, though I understand why you confuse the two." Damien said nothing. He had stopped arguing with his sister's observations months ago, mostly because she was usually right, and being right about painful things did not make her wrong to say them. "The council meets tomorrow," Cassia continued. "They will ask you again about naming an heir, about considering a new alliance. You cannot keep avoiding this conversation forever. I know what the council wants. Then give it to them, or give them a different answer, but stop standing at frozen streams pretending the past will change if you stare at it long enough." Damien exhaled slowly, watching his breath disappear into the darkness. "Do you think she is alive, Cassia?" His sister was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I think if she were dead, you would feel it. The bond does not simply go silent when someone dies, it breaks, violently, and everyone nearby feels the echo of that break. You have felt nothing like that, only silence. Silence is not the same as an ending." It was the first comfort Damien had allowed himself to accept in months, the idea that her silence might mean survival rather than loss. He held on to that thought as he walked back toward the castle beside his sister, neither of them speaking again until they reached the gates. Meanwhile, in the kingdom that had quietly taken in a nameless frozen stranger, Elena Voss was slowly becoming someone new. She had spent her first weeks in Alaric Thorne's castle saying almost nothing, answering questions about her identity, with vague half-truths that satisfied no one but were accepted without pressure. The healers who tended to her frostbitten hands never asked why a young woman would be traveling alone through such dangerous territory in the dead of winter. The servants who brought her meals never questioned her silence, and King Alaric himself, though clearly curious, never once demanded answers she was not ready to give. It was this quality above all else that eventually earned her trust, the simple fact that he did not push. "You do not have to tell me anything," he said to her one evening, weeks after her arrival, finding her alone in the castle library where she had taken to spending most of her time. "But if you ever wish to stay here longer than a season, you will need a name people can use and something useful to occupy your days. Idleness breeds sorrow, in my experience." Elena studied him carefully before answering. Alaric Thorne was tall, with dark hair beginning to gray slightly at the temples despite his relatively young age, and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of long years spent ruling alone. He was not a wolf shifter, as she had first assumed, but something rarer, a bloodline of old magic users who had ruled this neutral territory for generations, respected by wolf packs and human kingdoms alike for their fairness and their refusal to take sides in outside conflicts. "Clara," she said finally, choosing the name without much thought beyond the fact that it felt distant enough from her old life to offer some protection. "You may call me Clara." "Clara," Alaric repeated, testing the sound of it. A fine name. And what is it you know how to do, beyond surviving frozen forests? I managed accounts for my former household, Elena said carefully, keeping her answer vague. Trade agreements, resource allocation. Numbers were always easy for me. Alaric's expression shifted into something like genuine interest. My treasurer retired last season, and his replacement is proving less capable than I hoped. Perhaps you would consider assisting him, at least until you decide your next steps. It was meant as a simple offer of temporary work, nothing more. Neither of them could have predicted how quickly Elena, now Clara, would prove herself indispensable to the running of Alaric's kingdom. Within 2 months, she had reorganized the Treasury's entire record-keeping system, identifying wasted spending that had gone unnoticed for years. Within 4 months, she had renegotiated 3 separate trade agreements with neighboring territories, securing better terms than the kingdom had enjoyed in over a decade. By the time winter turned to spring, Alaric found himself consulting her not just on financial matters, but on nearly every decision that crossed his desk. "You have a mind for this," he told her one afternoon, reviewing a proposal she had drafted for expanding the kingdom's trade routes to the eastern territories. More than a mind for it, actually. A gift. "I had good reason to learn quickly," Elena replied, offering nothing further about what that reason might have been. Alaric did not press, as always, though she noticed the way his eyes lingered on her sometimes, curious and thoughtful, as though he were slowly piecing together a puzzle from fragments she gave him without meaning to. He never asked directly about her past, about the scars she carried that had nothing to do with the frostbite that had originally brought her to his castle. But he watched, and he waited, and he made himself a steady, unthreatening presence in her days. It was during the first true test of the kingdom's stability, nearly 8 months after her arrival, that Elena's transformation from broken refugee to trusted advisor became undeniable to everyone in the castle. A neighboring lord, greedy for expanded territory, attempted to manipulate a trade dispute into justification for military action against Alaric's borders. The situation escalated quickly, with the lord's messengers delivering increasingly aggressive demands, backed by the implicit threat of armed conflict. Alaric's council, most of them older men set in traditional ways of handling such disputes, argued for an immediate show of military force to discourage further aggression. Elena, invited to observe the council meeting due to her financial expertise, spoke up for the first time in a matter that had nothing directly to do with numbers. "A show of force will give him exactly what he wants," she said, her voice steady, despite the surprised glances from council members, unaccustomed to her speaking on military matters. "He is testing how easily this kingdom can be provoked into conflict. If you respond with aggression, you confirm to every watching territory that Alaric's kingdom can be manipulated through pressure. Instead, offer him a trade concession so generous it embarrasses him in front of his own allies, something so far beyond reasonable that refusing it would make him look foolish and greedy to everyone watching." The council was skeptical, but Alaric, intrigued, allowed her to draft the proposal herself. The result was a trade offer so favorable to the neighboring lord that he had no reasonable grounds to refuse it without appearing unreasonable to his own people. He accepted, the conflict dissolved without a single warrior being called to arms, and Alaric's kingdom gained a valuable new trade partner in the process. "You think like someone who has survived far worse than frostbite," Alaric said to her privately after the council meeting concluded, the two of them alone in his private study. "Someone who has learned, painfully, how power actually moves in this world." Elena did not deny it. "Everyone carries scars, Your Majesty. Some are simply easier to hide than others." "You do not have to hide yours from me," Alaric said quietly. "Not forever, at least." It was the closest he had ever come to directly asking about her past, and Elena found, to her own surprise, that she did not resent the question the way she might have resented it from anyone else. There was something in the way Alaric asked, patient and without demand, that made her wonder if perhaps she had finally found a place where honesty would not be used against her. She was not ready to tell him everything, not yet. But for the first time since that terrible night by the frozen stream, she found herself considering the possibility that a future existed beyond simply surviving each day, a future where she might actually choose the direction of her own life rather than fleeing from someone else's decisions. Back in Damien's kingdom, the council's pressure regarding an heir had grown impossible to ignore. Cassia had been right, as usual. Damien could not spend the rest of his reign staring at frozen streams and waiting for silence to become something more. He agreed, finally, to attend a regional summit scheduled for the following spring, an event bringing together rulers from every neighboring territory to discuss trade, security, and alliances across the region. It was, his advisors assured him, an excellent opportunity to re-establish his kingdom's standing after the turbulence of the past year, and perhaps, though no one said it directly, an opportunity to consider new prospects for marriage that his council had been quietly hinting at for months. Damien agreed to attend, though not for the reasons his advisors imagined. Somewhere in the back of his mind, in a place he did not examine too closely, he held on to a faint, irrational hope that traveling beyond his own borders might bring him some new information, some clue, some fragment of the woman who had vanished so completely from his life. He had no way of knowing that the summit's location had recently been changed, at the last moment, to accommodate the growing prominence of a kingdom that had spent the past year quietly strengthening its trade relationships across the entire region. A kingdom ruled by a man named Alaric Thorn. In the weeks leading up to his departure for the summit, Damien found himself unable to shake a strange restlessness that Cassia noticed immediately, though she could not quite name its source any more than he could. "You seem different lately," she observed one afternoon, watching her brother review travel arrangements with unusual attention to detail he normally left entirely to his advisors, almost hopeful, though I cannot imagine what has changed. "I do not know what has changed either," Damien admitted. "Only that something feels different, as though the world is shifting in a direction I cannot yet see clearly." He did not know, of course, that this restlessness stemmed from the faintest, almost imperceptible stirring of the fated bond, still too distant and too weak to fully register as anything more than an unexplained feeling of anticipation. He attributed it instead to simple hope that the summit might finally offer some fresh lead in his long search, some traveler who had seen a lone woman passing through unfamiliar territory, some scrap of information that had eluded his trackers for years. The northern messenger who had once brought the fateful proposal that destroyed his engagement had long since been dismissed from any position of influence, the failed alliance a permanent stain on both his reputation and the advisor who had orchestrated it. Damien had learned, slowly and painfully, to distrust proposals that promised easy advantage at the cost of another person's dignity, a lesson that had reshaped nearly every decision he made as king in the years following Elena's disappearance. His kingdom had grown more cautious under his leadership, more deliberate in its alliances, less willing to treat its neighbors as simple pieces to be maneuvered for advantage. Some of his older advisors grumbled that this new caution had cost the kingdom valuable opportunities, but Damien held firm, unwilling to repeat the mistake that had cost him everything that mattered most. As his carriage finally departed for the long journey toward the summit's newly announced location, Damien glanced back once at the castle that had felt increasingly hollow without Elena's presence, wondering, not for the first time, whether this journey might finally bring him the answers he had spent 3 years desperately seeking. A scout wearing the colors of a pack Elena had hoped never to see again, arrived at the edge of Alaric's territory on a gray morning in early autumn, nearly a year and a half after she had first stumbled into this kingdom, half frozen and nameless. Elena saw him from the treasury window before anyone announced his presence, and her entire body went still with recognition. She knew that crest, the crossed branches stitched onto his traveling cloak, belonging to a pack allied with the very territory she had fled. For one terrifying moment, she was certain her old life had finally caught up to her, that someone had traced her path across the border and sent a messenger to expose everything she had worked so hard to bury. She forced herself to breathe normally, to continue reviewing the ledger in front of her as though nothing had changed, though her hands trembled slightly against the pages. When Alaric's steward came to inform the court that the scout carried only routine trade correspondence unrelated to any missing persons or fugitive searches, Elena felt relief flood through her so completely that she had to steady herself against the edge of her desk. Still, the encounter left her shaken in a way she had not expected. That evening, unable to settle her thoughts, she found herself walking the castle's outer gardens long after most of the household had retired for the night, the cold air sharp against her face. "You looked like you had seen a ghost this morning," Alaric said, appearing beside her without announcement, his footsteps quiet on the frost-covered stone path. "The scout unsettled you." Elena considered lying, offering some vague deflection, as she had done countless times before. But something about the quiet garden, the honest concern in his voice, made the words come more easily than she expected. "I came from a pack allied with his territory," she admitted, the first true piece of her past she had ever willingly shared. "I did not leave under pleasant circumstances." Alaric did not press for more, though she could see the questions forming behind his patient eyes. "You are safe here, Clara. Whatever circumstances brought you to my border, this kingdom does not answer to outside pack law, and I do not intend to start now." "You do not even know what I might have done," Elena said quietly. I could be fleeing punishment for something terrible. I have watched you for a year and a half, Alaric said. I have seen how you treat the servants who have no power over your future, how you handle disputes with fairness, even when unfairness would benefit you, how you spend your own limited resources helping refugee families who arrive at our borders with nothing. Whatever happened in your past, I do not believe cruelty is part of your nature. Elena felt something tighten in her chest, an old ache mixed with something unfamiliar and warm. No one had spoken to her with such simple, unwavering faith in longer than she could remember. Certainly not the man who had once promised to marry her while quietly bargaining her future away to strangers. I did nothing wrong, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I only discovered something I could not forgive, and I chose to leave rather than live a life built on that betrayal. Then you made a brave choice, Alaric said. Leaving is rarely as simple as people imagine, especially when the life left behind holds power and comfort. Most people choose comfortable dishonesty over difficult truth. You chose otherwise. They stood together in silence for a while longer, watching frost settle over the garden's dormant flower beds, and Elena found herself, for the first time since that terrible night by the castle in her old life, thinking that perhaps she had not simply escaped one painful situation, only to drift aimlessly through the world. Perhaps she had actually arrived somewhere that mattered. The following months brought a subtle but undeniable shift in the dynamic between Elena and Alaric. Where once their conversations had remained strictly professional, focused on treasury matters and trade negotiations, they now found themselves lingering after council meetings, sharing meals that had no formal purpose beyond simple company, exchanging thoughts on subjects far removed from governance. Alaric told her, slowly and in pieces over many evenings, about his own history, about growing up as the only heir to a bloodline that carried ancient magic increasingly rare in the world, about losing his parents to illness when he was barely old enough to rule, about the isolation that came with a crown that made outsiders view him as either a valuable ally or a dangerous unknown, never simply a person. I never expected to marry, he admitted one evening, the two of them sharing wine in his private study, long after the rest of the castle had gone quiet. Every potential match came wrapped in political calculation. Every conversation with visiting nobility felt like a negotiation, rather than genuine connection. I decided long ago that ruling alone was preferable to ruling beside someone who saw me only as a valuable position to secure. And now? Elena asked, surprising herself with the question. Alaric met her eyes across the small table between them, something unguarded and honest in his expression that she had not seen from him before. Now I find myself uncertain whether that decision remains as wise as it once seemed. Elena did not respond immediately, uncertain of her own feelings, uncertain whether she was ready to consider such possibilities after everything that had happened, but she did not look away from him either, and something passed between them in that silence that neither of them tried to name just yet. Word arrived shortly after that a young lord from a nearby territory had begun making inquiries about a possible marriage alliance with Alaric's kingdom, hoping to arrange an introduction to any eligible woman of standing within the court. Alaric's advisors, always eager to strengthen useful connections, suggested that Clara, given her rising prominence within the treasury and her evident intelligence, might make an excellent match for such a proposal. Elena felt an unexpected wave of discomfort at the suggestion, though she could not immediately identify why the idea troubled her so much. It was Alaric himself who dismissed the proposal without hesitation during the council discussion, stating simply that Clara's personal decisions regarding marriage were entirely her own to make, and that the council had no business arranging such matters on her behalf. Later that evening, when Elena thanked him privately for defending her autonomy in the matter, Alaric's response revealed more than perhaps he intended. I did not defend your autonomy purely out of principle, he admitted, a rare flush of embarrassment coloring his usually composed expression. I found myself unable to imagine watching you leave this castle to build a life alongside someone else. Elena's breath caught at the honesty in his words. She thought of Damien, of promises once made and easily broken, of a fated bond that had meant nothing when weighed against political convenience. She thought of how different this felt, a man offering her choice rather than obligation, honesty rather than hidden calculation. I am not ready to make promises I cannot keep, she said carefully, though she did not step away from him. I carry more history than you know, Alaric. More pain than I have shared. I am not asking for promises tonight, Alaric said gently, only for permission to hope. Elena allowed herself, for the first time in over a year, to imagine a future that did not involve constant vigilance against her own past catching up to her. A future where she might actually build something real, something chosen freely rather than assigned by fate or forced by circumstance. She did not give him an answer that night, but she also did not refuse him. And in the months that followed, as autumn turned once again toward winter, the careful distance between them continued to close, one honest conversation at a time. There were setbacks along the way, moments when old fear resurfaced without warning. A visiting delegation from a southern territory once mentioned, in passing conversation during a formal dinner, rumors of an alpha king still searching for a vanished bride, and Elena had excused herself from the table so abruptly that several guests exchanged concerned glances. Alaric found her afterward in the quiet of the library, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of a bookshelf for support. "I am sorry," she said, before he could ask. "I did not mean to cause a scene." "You do not need to apologize for feeling frightened," Alaric said gently, keeping a respectful distance rather than crowding her with unwanted closeness. "Fear does not disappear simply because we wish it to. It fades slowly, through safety proven again and again over time." "What if he finds me?" she asked quietly, voicing the fear she had carried silently for over a year. "What if this peace I have built here is only temporary? Then we will face that possibility together, if it ever comes," Alaric said. "But Clara, you are not the same frightened woman who arrived at my border. You have built alliances of your own now, earned loyalty from people who would not easily allow harm to come to you. Whatever happens, you will not face it as helplessly as you once feared." His words offered a measure of comfort, though the underlying anxiety never fully vanished, simply settling into something more manageable, a quiet awareness rather than a constant, paralyzing dread. Elena found herself, in the months that followed, gradually allowing herself to imagine a future in this kingdom, without the constant expectation that her past might arrive to shatter it at any moment. Alaric, for his part, never pushed harder than she was ready for, always following her lead, always respecting the boundaries she set, even as those boundaries slowly expanded to include more trust, more closeness, more genuine hope for what might eventually grow between them. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Alaric's kingdom in snow weeks before the usual season, and with it came a crisis that would test everything Elena had built within her adopted home. A fever swept through the eastern villages first, spreading quickly among families already weakened by an unusually harsh harvest season. Within days, reports reached the castle of entire households falling ill, of healers overwhelmed by the number of patients arriving at their doors, of supplies running dangerously low as the sickness showed no sign of slowing. Alaric convened his council immediately, but it was Elena who identified the true scope of the danger before anyone else recognized it. "This is not simply seasonal illness," she said, studying the reports spread across the council table with the same careful attention she gave to trade ledgers. "The pattern of spread, the speed of infection, this matches accounts I once read of plagues that swept through crowded human cities generations ago. If we do not act decisively within days, this could spread to every village in the kingdom, including this castle." The council, accustomed to trusting her judgment on financial matters, found themselves less certain about trusting her assessment of a medical crisis. Several members argued for a measured response, worried about the cost of aggressive quarantine measures and the disruption to trade that such actions would cause. "The cost of hesitation will be measured in lives, not coin," Elena argued, her voice sharp with an urgency that silenced the room. "I have seen what happens when the powerful choose to protect their comfort over protecting their people. I will not stand by and let that happen here." There was something in her tone, some deep and personal conviction, that made even the most skeptical council members reconsider their objections. Alaric, watching her with quiet admiration, made his decision. "We follow Clara's recommendation," he said simply. "Full quarantine measures for affected villages, immediate deployment of healers and supplies from the castle's reserves, and any additional resources needed to contain this before it spreads further." The following weeks tested every ounce of strength Elena possessed. She worked alongside Alaric almost constantly, organizing supply distributions, coordinating with healers across the kingdom, managing the delicate balance between containing the illness and maintaining enough normal function to prevent the kingdom's economy from collapsing entirely under the strain. She saw suffering during those weeks that reminded her, painfully, of losses within her own former pack, of illnesses that had swept through vulnerable communities, while those in power debated costs and consequences rather than acting swiftly to help. But she also saw something she had never witnessed in her old life, a ruler who worked alongside his people, rather than simply issuing orders from a distant throne. Alaric visited the quarantined villages himself, despite his advisors' warnings about the risk to his own health, insisting that his people needed to see their king present during their suffering, rather than hidden safely behind castle walls. Elena accompanied him on several of these visits, distributing supplies and comforting frightened families, earning a level of trust and affection from the common people that surprised even her. "You did not have to come with me today," Alaric told her one evening, after a particularly difficult visit to a village that had lost several elderly residents to the fever. "The council would understand if you preferred to manage matters from the safety of the castle. I have hidden from difficult things before," Elena said quietly, thinking of that terrible night she had run from her old life rather than face its consequences. "I promised myself I would not do so again if I could help it." By the time the fever finally began to subside, nearly 6 weeks after the first reports had reached the castle, the kingdom had suffered losses, but far fewer than might have occurred without swift intervention. The eastern villages in particular credited their survival directly to the quarantine measures implemented so quickly under Elena's guidance. "They are calling you a hero in the eastern territories," Alaric told her, a note of quiet pride in his voice as they reviewed the final reports together in his study. "Some are even suggesting a formal recognition ceremony." Elena felt an unfamiliar warmth at the words, pride mixed with something deeper, a sense that perhaps she had finally found a way to transform her painful past into something meaningful, rather than simply something to survive. "I do not need ceremonies," she said. "Knowing the villages survived is enough." "Go, perhaps for you," Alaric said. "But allow your people this small joy, Clara. They wish to honor someone who chose to stand beside them during their darkest hour, rather than simply ruling from a distance." The ceremony, when it finally took place in the Great Hall weeks later, marked a turning point that Elena had not fully anticipated. Standing before representatives from every village in the kingdom, receiving genuine gratitude and respect that had nothing to do with her bloodline or her connection to any powerful family, she felt something settle within her that had been unsettled since that terrible night by the frozen stream. She had built something real here, not through inherited status or fated destiny, but through her own choices, her own actions, her own willingness to show up during difficult moments rather than simply existing in the shadows of someone else's kingdom. Alaric watched her during the ceremony with an expression that had grown increasingly difficult for either of them to disguise, affection deepening into something neither had quite named aloud, though everyone in the castle had begun to notice the shift between them regardless. "The council has begun asking questions," Cassia would have told her brother, had she known of the situation unfolding in a neighboring kingdom. Questions about succession, about the future of the crown, about whether their solitary king intended to remain unmarried forever, despite having found, in their own advisor's words, an obvious and worthy match already standing beside him in council meetings. Alaric addressed these whispered concerns directly one evening, several weeks after the recognition ceremony, finding Elena alone in the library where she still spent much of her quiet time, surrounded by books she had come to treasure during her years of exile. "The council believes I should marry," he said, settling into the chair across from her without preamble. "They have several candidates in mind, various daughters of allied territories, women whose families would strengthen our trade connections considerably." Elena felt an old, familiar tightness in her chest at his words, memories of Damien's calculated betrayal rising unbidden. "And what do you believe?" "I believe the council concerns itself too much with strategic alliances, and too little with genuine partnership," Alaric said. "I have watched you rebuild an entire section of this kingdom's economy from nothing. I have watched you organize relief efforts that saved countless lives during the fever crisis. I have watched you earn genuine love from people who owe you nothing, and yet trust you completely." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I do not wish to marry for strategic alliance, Clara. I wish to marry someone I trust completely, someone who has proven her character through action rather than bloodline, someone I have come to care for more deeply than I ever expected to care for anyone again." Elena's heart raced at the directness of his words, so different from the careful political calculation that had once ended her previous engagement in disaster and heartbreak. She thought of everything she had built here, the trust, the respect, the genuine partnership that had grown slowly and honestly between them over nearly 2 years. "I have not told you everything about my past," she said quietly. "There are things you deserve to know before any decision is made." "Then tell me," Alaric said simply. "Whatever it is, Clara, I do not believe it will change how I see you, but I understand your need to be honest before we move forward, if moving forward is something you wish to consider." Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 2 years of carefully guarded silence pressing against her chest, and began, for the first time since arriving in this kingdom, to tell someone the complete truth about the woman she had been before she became Clara. Before that conversation could unfold fully, however, the fever crisis had left its own permanent mark on her understanding of what genuine leadership required. She often thought back, in quiet moments, to a particular family in the easternmost village, a widow named Grace, raising 3 young children alone after losing her husband to an early illness years before. When the fever swept through their small home, Elena had personally ensured their household received supplies and medicine before larger, wealthier families further from the village center, a decision that drew quiet criticism from a few council members who felt resources should follow influence rather than need. The wealthy families have the means to care for themselves, Elena had argued firmly during one heated council discussion. Grace has nothing beyond what this kingdom chooses to provide. If we measure our compassion only by influence, we have already failed the very people who trust us most. Alaric had supported her decision without hesitation, and the widow's family survived the fever intact, one small victory among the larger crisis that Elena carried with quiet pride long after the immediate danger had passed. Grace herself, upon recovering, had traveled to the castle personally to offer her thanks, bringing with her a small basket of preserved fruit as the only gift her modest means allowed. "You did not have to help us first," Grace had said, tears in her eyes, as she stood before the woman she still knew only as Clara. "Many rulers would have looked past families like mine entirely. Every family in this kingdom matters equally," Elena had replied, meaning every word completely. "I promise you that as long as I have any voice in how this kingdom is governed." It was moments like these, small and personal rather than grand and political, that had gradually convinced Elena that perhaps she belonged in this new life more completely than she had ever belonged in the one she left behind. The crown she was beginning to imagine wearing here would mean something entirely different from the crown she had once fled, forged through genuine service rather than simple inheritance or strategic arrangement. She told him everything, sitting in the quiet library with only candlelight between them, the words coming slowly at first and then in an unstoppable flood once she allowed herself to begin. She told him about growing up within a powerful pack, about being chosen as fated mate to an alpha king destined for greatness, about years spent believing in a bond that stories described as unbreakable and true. She told him about the wedding that never happened, about standing outside a door and hearing her future discussed like a trade agreement, her worth measured only in the military alliance she could secure through marriage. She told him about running into the night with nothing but a small bag of coins and her father's old knife, about collapsing near a frozen stream, with no plan beyond escaping a life built on betrayal. She told him about the fear that had haunted her first months in his kingdom, the constant worry that someone might recognize her, might drag her back to a life she had chosen to abandon. Alaric listened without interruption, his expression shifting through concern, quiet anger, and finally something like deep understanding as she finished her account. "His name was Damian Cross," she said finally, watching for any reaction the name might provoke. "Alpha King of a territory to the south. I do not know if he searched for me. I do not know if he even noticed I was gone, beyond whatever inconvenience my absence caused to his political plans." "He noticed," Alaric said quietly, surprising her. "Rumors of a vanished bride reached even this kingdom eventually, though I did not connect them to you until just now. There were whispers, over a year ago, of an alpha king who searched relentlessly for a missing mate, whose kingdom suffered political consequences when an important alliance collapsed following her disappearance." Elena felt a strange mixture of emotions at this revelation, vindication that her absence had mattered in some way, mixed with old anger that any consequence he suffered came only from losing a useful political asset, rather than genuine grief over losing her specifically. "It does not matter now," she said, though the words felt slightly uncertain even to her own ears. "That life is behind me. I chose this kingdom, this new name, this new purpose. I do not wish to return to what I left behind." "I have no intention of asking you to return to anything," Alaric said firmly. "I only wanted you to know that I understand now why you carried such careful walls when you first arrived, why trust came so slowly and required such patience. Your caution was earned through genuine betrayal, not simple fear." He reached across the small distance between them, taking her hand gently, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. She did not pull away. "I meant what I said before you began your story," Alaric continued. "Nothing you have told me changes how I see you, Clara. If anything, it only deepens my respect for the strength it took to build an entirely new life from nothing, to transform such painful betrayal into something as remarkable as what you have accomplished within this kingdom." Elena felt tears gather in her eyes for the first time in longer than she could remember. Not tears of grief, but something closer to relief. the relief of finally being fully known by someone, and finding that full knowledge did not diminish their regard for her. "I am not the same woman who ran from that castle 2 years ago," she said softly. "I do not know if I could ever fully trust the same way I once did, blindly, without question." "I am not asking for blind trust," Alaric said. "I am asking for the kind of trust that grows slowly, through consistent honesty and genuine partnership, the kind you have already given me, through countless small moments over these past 2 years. I am asking if you might consider building a future with me, not because fate demands it, but because we have chosen each other through our own actions and our own free will." Elena studied his face in the candlelight, searching for any trace of the calculated ambition that had once destroyed her faith in promises of love. She found none, only genuine warmth, genuine respect, and something that looked remarkably like hope. "Ask me properly," she said finally, a small smile beginning to form despite the weight of everything they had just discussed. "If you truly wish to build a future together, Alaric, ask me the way it deserves to be asked." Alaric's expression shifted into surprised delight at her response, understanding immediately what she meant. He rose from his chair, moving around the small table to kneel before her, taking both her hands in his. "Clara Voss," he said, using the name she had chosen for herself, honoring the identity she had built, rather than the one she had left behind. "Though you know I now understand your true name as well, I ask you not as a king seeking strategic alliance, but as a man who has come to love you through 2 years of watching your strength, your intelligence, and your unwavering commitment to doing what is right, even when it is difficult. Will you marry me, not out of destiny or obligation, but out of genuine choice?" "Yes," Elena said, the word coming easily and without hesitation, a stark contrast to the uncertainty and fear that had colored every decision in the 2 years since her escape. "Yes, Alaric. I choose you." Word of the engagement spread through the castle within days, met with genuine celebration from servants and council members alike who had watched their solitary king slowly transform into someone capable of genuine joy over the past 2 years. The eastern villages, still grateful for her role during the fever crisis, celebrated the news with particular enthusiasm, viewing their future queen as someone who had already proven her devotion to their well-being long before any crown was placed upon her head. The wedding preparations that followed felt entirely different from the ceremony Elena had once fled in her old life. Rather than political calculations and strategic guest lists designed to secure alliances, the planning centered on genuine celebration, on honoring the community that had welcomed her, on building a ceremony that reflected the authentic partnership she and Alaric had built together. "Are you certain you do not wish for a larger ceremony?" Alaric asked her one evening, reviewing the modest guest list she had prepared. "As queen, certain formalities are typically expected. I have already survived one grand ceremony that meant nothing beneath its surface," Elena said. "I would rather have a smaller gathering filled with people who genuinely care for our future than a spectacle designed to impress outside observers." Alaric agreed without argument, understanding completely the weight behind her preference. The ceremony, when it finally took place on a clear spring morning nearly 2.5 years after Elena had first arrived in his kingdom, was intimate by royal standards but rich with genuine emotion. Servants who had cared for her during her first frozen nights in the castle stood alongside council members who had come to respect her judgment, alongside representatives from the eastern villages who considered her a hero in their own right. She wore a simple gown, nothing like the elaborate silk she had once been fitted for in her old life, and felt more beautiful in its simplicity than she had ever felt wrapped in the finest fabric her old kingdom could provide. When Alaric placed the crown upon her head during the ceremony, formally naming her Queen Clara of his kingdom, she felt none of the hollow obligation that had haunted her previous engagement. This crown had been offered freely, chosen deliberately, earned through genuine partnership rather than assigned by fate or political convenience. She wore it not as a burden or a bargaining chip, but as a symbol of everything she had rebuilt from the ashes of her old life. "You look happy," Cassia would have observed, had she been present to witness the ceremony, though word of a distant kingdom's new queen would not reach her brother's court until months later, carried along ordinary trade routes with no particular urgency attached to the news. For nearly a year following the wedding, Elena lived in a peace she had never expected to find again, ruling alongside a husband who valued her partnership as much as her presence, respected by a kingdom that had watched her earn every ounce of their trust through genuine action, rather than inherited privilege. She did not know, during that peaceful year, that fate had not entirely finished with her story. She did not know that a regional summit, scheduled to strengthen trade relationships across every neighboring territory, had recently been relocated to accommodate the growing prominence of her adopted kingdom. She did not know that the Alpha King she had once fled would soon walk through her own castle's grand hall, forced by diplomatic obligation to attend a gathering that would finally, after nearly 3 years of searching and silence, reveal exactly where his missing fated mate had disappeared to all those years ago. In the months following her wedding, Elena had thrown herself into her new duties as queen, with the same determined energy she had once used to survive her first winter in this kingdom. She established a formal council seat specifically dedicated to representing the concerns of the kingdom's smaller villages, ensuring that families like Grace's would always have a direct voice in decisions that affected their lives. She expanded the treasury's relief funds to guard against future crises, learning from the fever's harsh lessons rather than simply moving past them once the immediate danger had ended. Alaric watched these efforts with quiet pride, often telling visiting delegates that his queen had transformed the kingdom's governance more thoroughly in a single year than most rulers managed across an entire reign. Their partnership, both personal and political, had become the subject of genuine admiration throughout the region, a rare example of a marriage built on mutual respect rather than pure strategic calculation. Cassia, though she remained unaware of exactly where her brother's missing mate had settled, occasionally heard fragments of praise for a distant kingdom's remarkable young queen during trade discussions with visiting merchants, praise for her fairness, her intelligence, her genuine devotion to her people. She never connected these distant rumors to her brother's lost love, for the name Clara meant nothing to her, carrying none of the history attached to the name Elena. It would take the specific circumstances of the relocated summit, a decision made by neutral organizing officials seeking a location central enough to accommodate every invited territory, to finally bring these two separate worlds crashing together, after nearly 3 years of complete and unknowing separation. Damian Cross froze mid-step in the grand hall, his entire body going rigid as though he had been struck by something invisible, and every conversation around him seemed to fade into meaningless noise. She stood beside the throne at the far end of the hall, dressed in deep blue silk that suited her far better than anything he had ever seen her wear, a crown resting on her head with an ease that suggested she had worn it for years rather than months. Her hair was styled differently, her posture carried an authority he did not recognize, but there was no mistaking her face, no mistaking the eyes that had haunted his memory for nearly 3 years. Elena. The fated bond, silent for so long that he had almost convinced himself it might never return, roared back to life in his chest with a violence that nearly brought him to his knees. He gripped the edge of a nearby table to steady himself, his breath coming in short, unsteady gasps that drew concerned glances from the delegates standing near him. "Your Majesty," his advisor murmured quietly, noticing his sudden distress. "Are you unwell?" Damian did not answer. He could not tear his eyes away from the woman standing beside King Alaric Thorne's throne, a woman introduced to the gathered delegates only moments before as Queen Clara, beloved ruler of this territory, and hero of the fever crisis that had swept through the eastern villages years earlier. Queen Clara, not Elena. A different name for a woman he had spent 3 years searching for across every territory his influence could reach. She met his eyes across the crowded hall, and he watched, with growing disbelief, as recognition flickered briefly across her expression before settling into something cold and controlled, and composure so complete it felt almost like a physical wall erected between them. She did not gasp, she did not falter. She simply held his gaze for a long moment, acknowledging without words that she recognized him completely, before turning her attention calmly back to the delegate she had been speaking with before his arrival interrupted her focus. Damian felt something inside him shatter and rebuild simultaneously, 3 years of grief and confusion crystallizing suddenly into a single, undeniable truth. She was alive, she was well, she had built an entirely new life, complete with a new name and a new crown, in a kingdom that had somehow remained invisible to every search he had conducted. And she looked at him as though he were nothing more than a distant, unpleasant memory. "You know Queen Clara?" his advisor asked quietly, noticing the intensity of his stare. "I need a moment," Damian said, his voice rougher than he intended. He turned abruptly and made his way toward a side corridor, needing distance from the crowded hall, needing air, needing time to process what he had just witnessed before he did something that might embarrass himself or his kingdom in front of every ruler in the region. Cassia found him there minutes later, having noticed his abrupt departure from the main gathering. She took one look at his face, pale and shaken despite his usual composed bearing, and immediately understood. "It is her," Cassia said quietly, not phrasing it as a question. The bond reacted. I felt the shift in your energy from across the hall. She is their queen, Damien said, his voice barely above a whisper. She married their king. She has been here, alive, safe, building an entire life while I searched every territory believing she might be dead in some ditch, believing I might never learn what happened to her. Brother, Cassia said carefully, you must remember why she left in the first place. This is not simply a joyful reunion waiting to happen. Damien's jaw tightened at the reminder, old guilt mixing with the overwhelming force of the fated bond that had suddenly reawakened after years of aching silence. He remembered exactly why she had left, remembered the conversation with the northern messenger she must have overheard, remembered every calculated decision he had made that valued political advantage over the woman he had claimed to love. I need to speak with her, he said. I need to explain, to apologize, to understand how she survived all this time. She is a married queen now, Cassia reminded him gently but firmly. Whatever explanation you offer, whatever apology you attempt, you cannot simply demand her attention as though the past 3 years have not happened. Tread carefully, brother. This is delicate territory for everyone involved, including our kingdoms standing at this summit. Damien knew his sister spoke wisdom, but the fated bond pulling relentlessly at his chest made careful patience feel nearly impossible. He had spent 3 years believing fate had abandoned him entirely, and now, faced with undeniable proof that Elena remained alive and connected to him through the same bond that had once brought them together, every instinct urged him toward immediate action. He forced himself to return to the summit gathering that evening, presenting a composed exterior despite the turmoil raging beneath the surface. He watched from a careful distance as Elena, no longer simply Elena but truly Queen Clara in every action and gesture, moved through the crowd with practiced ease, discussing trade agreements with visiting delegates, offering thoughtful insight on regional matters that clearly demonstrated years of genuine governance experience, rather than simple ceremonial duty. King Alaric Thorn remained close beside her throughout the evening, and Damien found himself studying the other king with an intensity that bordered on hostility, noting every small gesture of familiarity and affection that passed between them, every moment their hands brushed together, every quiet exchange that suggested a partnership built on genuine intimacy rather than mere political arrangement. They seem well matched, Cassia observed quietly, standing beside her brother as they watched the couple from across the hall. Whatever life she built here, brother, it appears to be a genuinely happy one. The observation, though clearly intended as gentle honesty rather than cruelty, struck Damien harder than any direct accusation could have. He had spent 3 years imagining Elena suffering somewhere, struggling alone, perhaps even regretting her decision to flee their engagement. He had never once imagined she might have found genuine happiness, genuine partnership, an entire life that suited her better than anything he had ever offered. Later that evening, as the summit's opening festivities wound toward their conclusion, Damien found himself alone in a quiet corridor when Elena, or Clara as she was known within these walls, appeared unexpectedly from an adjoining hallway, likely taking a private route back toward her chambers. She stopped abruptly upon seeing him, her composed expression flickering for just a moment before settling back into careful neutrality. "Your Majesty," she said formally, using the same distant courtesy she might offer any visiting delegate, though the tightness in her voice betrayed the effort such composure required. "I trust you are enjoying the summit's opening proceedings." "Elena," Damien said, ignoring her formal tone entirely, his voice rough with 3 years of accumulated emotion. "I need to speak with you, properly, alone." "My name is Clara now," she said, her voice hardening slightly, "and I do not believe we have anything requiring private conversation, Alpha King Cross. Whatever business brought you to this summit, I trust you will find the gathering productive." She moved a step past him, clearly intending to end the conversation before it truly began, but Damien, driven by 3 years of desperate searching and unresolved grief, reached out and caught her arm gently, stopping her retreat. "Please," he said, all pretense of royal composure abandoned entirely. 3 years, Elena. I searched for you for 3 years. I need to understand. I need you to at least hear what I have to say, even if you choose never to speak to me again afterward." Elena stared at his hand on her arm for a long moment before meeting his eyes directly, something fierce and unyielding burning behind her careful composure. "You searched for 3 years," she repeated slowly, "yet you never once considered searching your own conscience for the answer of why I left in the first place. You still do not understand, do you? This was never about being found, Damien. This was about whether I would ever be seen as more than a useful arrangement to secure your ambitions." She pulled her arm free from his grasp, stepping back with deliberate distance. "I will grant you one private conversation, she said finally, her voice controlled despite the emotion clearly simmering beneath her words. Tomorrow, in the privacy of the Eastern Garden, before the summit's formal sessions begin, you may say whatever you feel you must say. But understand clearly, Damien, that whatever explanation you offer will not undo the choice I made, nor the life I have built since making it. She left him standing alone in the quiet corridor, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread at the prospect of finally confronting the truth he had spent 3 years both desperately seeking and secretly fearing. He did not sleep that night, replaying every word she had spoken, every flash of anger and old pain that had crossed her face during their brief exchange. He thought of the frightened, heartbroken young woman who had once loved him completely, and he tried to reconcile that memory with the composed, formidable queen who had just spoken to him with such unwavering command of her own worth. Cassia found him near dawn, still awake, staring out the window of his guest chamber toward the Eastern Garden where their conversation would take place in only a few hours. You should rest, she said gently. Whatever tomorrow brings, you will face it better with a clear mind. How can I rest, Cassia, when I finally have the chance to explain everything I have carried for 3 years? Damien said. I have imagined this conversation 1,000 times, and now that it is finally real, I find myself terrified I will say all the wrong things. Then say the true things, Cassia advised, not the things you rehearsed, not the things you believe she wants to hear, simply the truth of what you feel and what you have learned. She left because you were dishonest with her brother. Do not compound that original wound by offering anything less than complete honesty now. Her advice settled something restless within him, and though sleep still eluded him through the remaining hours of night, he found a measure of calm clarity by the time dawn finally broke over the castle grounds, ready to face whatever the garden conversation might bring. The Eastern Garden was empty when Damien arrived at dawn, mist still clinging low to the frost-covered grass, and he had spent most of the sleepless night rehearsing words that now felt inadequate the moment he saw Elena approaching along the stone path. She wore a simple traveling cloak rather than her royal gown, her expression composed but guarded, every step measured with the same careful control she had displayed the previous evening. She stopped a deliberate distance away from him, close enough for conversation but far enough to make clear that intimacy was not being offered. You have your private conversation, she said without preamble. Say what you came to say. Damien found himself struggling for the eloquent apology he had practiced through the night, the words scattering the moment he faced her directly. I was wrong, he said finally, simply. About everything, about the alliance, about treating you as a piece to be arranged, rather than the woman I was fortunate enough to have chosen as my mate. I have spent 3 years regretting that conversation you overheard, wishing I could take back every calculated word. Regret does not undo consequences, Elena said evenly. I ran that night not simply because of the alliance itself, but because of what it revealed. You were willing to trade my future, my choice, my voice in the matter, for military advantage. That was not a single mistake, Damien. That was who you were willing to become as king. I have changed, he said. These 3 years without you taught me things I refused to unlearn. I stopped viewing every relationship as strategic calculation. I began actually listening to my counsel rather than simply using them to secure advantage. I became, I believe, a better ruler because I finally understood what it cost to lose the thing that truly mattered. Elena studied him carefully, and for a brief moment, Damien thought he saw something soften in her expression, some flicker of the woman who had once loved him completely. I am glad you grew from that pain, she said finally. Truly, Damien, I hold no wish for you to suffer needlessly, but growth does not erase what happened, nor does it obligate me to return to what we once were. I am not asking you to return, Damien said, though even as he spoke the words he recognized the desperate hope underlying them. I am asking you to understand that the bond between us has never faded, not truly. I felt it reawaken the moment I saw you in that hall. Surely you felt something similar. Elena's composure flickered slightly at this direct acknowledgement of the faded connection between them, and she took a moment before answering, choosing her words with obvious care. The bond exists, she admitted quietly. I will not pretend otherwise. I felt it the moment our eyes met across that hall, just as I imagine you did. But Damien, a bond is not the same as a relationship built through genuine trust and honest partnership. Fate connected us through circumstances neither of us chose. Alaric, my husband, I chose freely, with full knowledge of my own history and my own worth. That choice means more to me than any bond assigned by forces beyond my control. You chose him because you never had the chance to choose properly with me, Damien argued, desperation creeping into his voice despite his effort to remain composed. If I had approached our engagement differently from the start, if I had valued you as I should have from the beginning, would you still have left? That question no longer matters, Elena said firmly. I cannot rebuild a version of the past that never happened. I can only speak to what actually occurred. And what actually occurred was betrayal severe enough to send me running into a frozen forest with nothing but a knife, and enough courage to survive whatever came next. That experience shaped who I am today, Damien. I do not regret the woman it created, even if I wish the pain that forged her had never been necessary. Damien fell silent, absorbing the full weight of her words, understanding perhaps for the first time the complete reality of what his actions had cost, not just in terms of losing her presence, but in terms of the suffering she had endured before finding safety and genuine partnership elsewhere. I am sorry, he said finally. The words simple, but carrying genuine weight after everything else he had said. Not sorry that you found happiness, Elena. Truly, I am glad of that. But sorry for every choice that made such suffering necessary in the first place. Sorry that I valued political advantage over your trust. Sorry that it took losing you completely to understand what I actually threw away. Elena's composed expression finally cracked slightly, genuine emotion breaking through her careful control for the first time during their conversation. Thank you for that apology, she said quietly. It means something, even now, even after everything. But Damien, an apology cannot undo the fact that I am married, that I have built a genuine life here, that Alaric has earned my trust and love through years of consistent honesty, in ways you never demonstrated during our engagement. Do you love him? Damien asked, the question escaping before he could stop himself, driven by a desperate need to understand the full reality of what he had lost. Elena did not hesitate in her answer. Completely, she said. Not because fate demanded it, but because I chose it, day after day, through every honest conversation and every moment of genuine partnership we built together. That choice means more to me than any bond assigned before I was old enough to understand what such a bond truly required. The finality in her voice left little room for further argument, and Damien felt the last fragile threads of hope he had carried through 3 years of searching finally, painfully, dissolve into acceptance. Then I wish you genuine happiness, he said, forcing sincerity into words that cost him considerable effort to speak. I will not pretend this conversation has been easy, Elena, or that I do not still feel the pull of our bond. But I understand now that understanding a connection exists is not the same as having any right to act upon it against your wishes. Thank you for understanding that, Elena said softly, some of the careful hostility finally easing from her expression now that the difficult conversation seemed to be reaching its conclusion. I do not wish for this summit to become complicated by matters between us, Damien. For the sake of both our kingdoms and for the genuine peace I have built here, I hope we can move forward as respectful neighbors rather than unresolved history. I will try, Damien said honestly. Though I cannot promise the bond will simply fade now that I have seen you again, spoken with you again, understood fully what I lost. Elena nodded, accepting his honesty, even if it complicated her hopes for a simple resolution. Then we will navigate that complication as it arises, she said. But Damien, understand this clearly. Whatever the bond demands, whatever fate might suggest, I have already made my choice. I chose Alaric. I choose him again, every single day. That will not change, regardless of what either of us feels when our paths happen to cross. She turned to leave the garden, her business concluded, but paused after several steps, glancing back at him with an expression that held genuine, if complicated, warmth. I am glad you are well, Damien, she said quietly. I hope you find, someday, the same genuine happiness I have found here. Not through fate or obligation, but through honest choice. She left him alone in the frost-covered garden, and Damien remained there long after her footsteps had faded, absorbing the complete reality of a conversation that had offered him understanding, without offering him any hope of the reconciliation his heart had desperately wanted. He did not yet know that the fated bond, now fully reawakened after years of silence, would not simply fade quietly into acceptance as he had promised her. He did not know that ancient pact law contained provisions regarding fated bonds that could complicate even the most genuine and hard-won happiness, provisions his desperate advisors would soon remind him existed, tempting him toward a path that would threaten everything Elena had built, and force her, once again, to fight for the right to choose her own future. Elena returned to her chambers that morning feeling lighter than she had in years, believing genuinely that the difficult conversation had brought the closure both of them needed. She shared the details with Alaric over a quiet breakfast, describing Damien's apology, his acceptance of her choice, the strange peace that had settled over her once the words she had carried for 3 years were finally spoken aloud. You seem relieved, Alaric observed. watching her expression carefully. I am, Elena admitted. I did not realize how much weight I still carried until I finally set it down. Whatever happens now, I feel like I can finally close that chapter completely. Alaric smiled, genuinely pleased to see the lightness in her demeanor, though a small, cautious part of him remained watchful, aware that reawakened bonds and desperate advisors sometimes proved more persistent than simple conversations could fully resolve. He said nothing of this quiet concern, unwilling to dim her genuine relief with speculation that might prove entirely unfounded. The summit continued through its scheduled sessions over the following 2 days, trade discussions and regional alliances proceeding normally, with Damien maintaining respectful distance and formal courtesy whenever their paths crossed during official proceedings. Elena began to believe, cautiously, that the difficult chapter had truly closed, that she could finally move forward without the weight of unresolved history following her through every future encounter with her past. She had no way of knowing that behind closed doors, in private council sessions she was not invited to witness, Damien's advisors had already begun quietly researching the ancient legal texts that would soon threaten to unravel the very peace she believed she had finally secured. Word of the garden conversation reached Damien's advisors within hours, carried by a servant who had glimpsed the two of them speaking privately, and reported the encounter with obvious curiosity to anyone willing to listen. By that evening, whispers had spread through the entire summit gathering, delegates from every territory speculating about the strange history apparently connecting their host kingdom's queen with the visiting Alpha King from the south. Alaric Thorne, informed of these rumors by his own concerned counsel, found Elena in their private chambers that evening, his expression carefully controlled but clearly troubled. "You spoke with him," Alaric said, not quite a question. "Privately, in the Eastern Garden." "I did," Elena confirmed without hesitation, unwilling to hide anything from a husband who had earned her complete honesty through years of genuine partnership. He asked for the opportunity to apologize, to understand how I survived these past years. I granted him one conversation, believing it might bring closure to a chapter neither of us had properly resolved. "And did it bring closure?" Alaric asked, watching her carefully. "For me, yes," Elena said firmly. "I told him clearly that my choice remains unchanged, that I love you completely, that whatever bond connects us through fate does not override the genuine partnership we have built together. I believe the matter settled." "You believed," Alaric repeated, something careful in his tone. "But you do not sound entirely certain now." Elena hesitated, honesty compelling her to share the full complexity of the situation, rather than offering false reassurance. "The fated bond reawakened the moment we saw each other again," she admitted. "I will not pretend otherwise, Alaric. It exists, whether either of us wishes it to or not. But I told him clearly that a bond does not obligate my choice, that I choose you freely regardless of what fate might suggest." Alaric absorbed this information silently, and Elena watched him carefully, searching for any sign of the jealous insecurity that might have driven a lesser man toward anger or demands. Instead, he simply reached for her hand, his expression thoughtful rather than threatened. "I trust your choice," he said finally. "I have watched you build an entire life through deliberate decision rather than circumstance. For nearly 3 years now, Clara. I do not fear a bond you have already told me, clearly and directly, does not command your loyalty. But I worry about him, about what a man driven by such reawakened connection might attempt, especially if his advisors begin viewing this situation through the lens of political advantage rather than personal feeling." His concern proved prophetic within days. As the summit progressed through its formal sessions, Damien's advisors, having learned of the fated bond connecting their king to the neighboring kingdom's queen, began quietly researching ancient pact laws that might offer legal standing to press a claim, regardless of Elena's current marriage. "Ancient tradition holds precedent for such situations," Damien's chief advisor explained during a private council session, presenting old texts recovered from the pact's historical archives. "A fated bond, once reawakened through direct proximity, grants the bonded parties certain rights under traditional pact law, rights that predate and, in some interpretations, supersede human or non-wolf marriage contracts." Damien listened to this explanation with a mixture of temptation and discomfort, the desperate hope he had carried for 3 years, warring against the genuine respect he had gained for Elena's autonomy during their garden conversation. "She has made her choice clear," Damien said slowly. "She does not wish to invoke such claims. Her wishes, while understandable, do not necessarily override traditional law," his advisor pressed. "Consider the political advantages, Your Majesty. A formal alliance between your kingdom and this territory, secured through the fated bond's legal standing, would strengthen your position considerably. Consider also the message such a claim would send throughout the region, re-establishing your authority after years of uncertainty following her original disappearance. You are suggesting I use ancient law to override her genuine marriage, Damien said, disgust creeping into his voice as he recognized the calculation being proposed, disturbingly similar to the very political maneuvering that had originally driven Elena away from him. I am suggesting you consider all available options before dismissing them entirely, his advisor said carefully. The bond itself suggests fate intends for your paths to remain intertwined, Your Majesty. Perhaps honoring that intention, rather than simply accepting her current circumstances, represents the wiser path forward. Cassia, present during this council session, watched her brother's expression carefully, recognizing the internal struggle playing out behind his composed exterior. Brother, she said quietly once the council session concluded and they found themselves alone, you cannot seriously be considering this path. You spoke with her directly. She told you clearly that her choice remains Alaric, that the bond does not command her loyalty. Pursuing ancient legal claims against her wishes would be a betrayal far more severe than anything that originally drove her away. I know, Damien said, frustration evident in his voice. I know exactly what such a path would represent, Cassia. But the bond, now that it has reawakened, aches constantly. Every moment I remain near this kingdom without acting upon it feels like willfully ignoring what fate clearly intends. Fate does not override choice, Cassia said firmly. You taught yourself that lesson painfully over these past 3 years, watching a bond go silent while she built an entire life without you. Do not now abandon that hard-won wisdom, simply because proximity has reawakened old feelings you have not yet learned to properly manage. Despite his sister's counsel, and despite his own genuine misgivings, the temptation proved difficult to fully dismiss, particularly as his advisors continued pressing the political advantages such a claim might offer. Meanwhile, word of these internal deliberations within Damien's council began reaching Alaric's own advisors through the network of servants and minor officials that inevitably carried information between different delegations attending the summit. They are considering invoking ancient pact law, Alaric's chief advisor warned during an urgent private meeting. A legal claim based on the fated bond, potentially threatening the legitimacy of your marriage to Queen Clara under traditional wolf pack tradition, regardless of how such tradition might be viewed by our own kingdom's laws. Alaric's expression darkened considerably at this information. Such a claim would have no standing within my territory, he said firmly. My kingdom does not answer to wolf pack tradition, ancient or otherwise. True, his advisor acknowledged, but pursuing such a claim publicly, at a summit attended by every ruler in the region, could create significant political complications regardless of its actual legal standing here. Other territories might view the situation as ambiguous, potentially straining alliances built on the assumption of stable, uncontested royal marriages. Alaric found Elena that evening in their private chambers, sharing this troubling information with the directness that had come to define their partnership. He is considering invoking the fated bond as ancient legal claim, Alaric told her, watching her expression carefully as she absorbed this new complication. His advisors believe such a claim might carry political weight, regardless of your current marriage. Elena's expression hardened with a mixture of anger and weary resignation, old patterns of political calculation once again threatening to override her own agency and choice. He promised me understanding, she said, frustration evident in her voice. He stood in that garden and acknowledged clearly that my choice remains unchanged, that fate does not command my loyalty. Perhaps he still believes that, Alaric said carefully, but advisors driven by political calculation rather than genuine feeling often find ways to justify actions that serve their kingdom's interests, regardless of personal conviction. I do not know whether Damien will ultimately pursue this path, Clara, but the possibility exists, and we must prepare for how to respond if he does. Elena rose from her seat, pacing slowly across their private chamber, as she absorbed the full weight of this new threat to the life she had built so carefully over the past 3 years. I will not simply accept being treated as property once again, she said firmly, old fire returning to her voice, the same determination that had driven her to survive a frozen forest, rather than accept a life built on betrayal. If he pursues this claim, I will fight it directly, publicly if necessary, before every ruler gathered at this summit. I built this life through my own choices, Alaric. I will not allow ancient tradition or reawakened bonds to erase that choice now. Alaric rose as well, moving to stand beside her, his presence steady and reassuring despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Whatever comes, Clara, you will not face it alone. We built this partnership together, and we will defend it together, regardless of what claims ancient tradition might attempt to assert. Neither of them yet knew how quickly the situation would escalate, nor how directly Elena would be forced to publicly declare, before an audience of every regional ruler, exactly whose crown she intended to keep, and exactly whose claims she intended to reject entirely. That night, unable to settle her racing thoughts, Elena walked the castle's familiar corridors alone, passing the library where she had once spent countless quiet hours rebuilding herself from nothing, passing the treasury office where she had first proven her worth beyond simple survival. Every room held a memory of the woman she had become, and she refused to let ancient tradition erase any of it, simply because ancient tradition claimed a prior, unchosen bond mattered more than years of deliberate, hard-won growth. She found Alaric still awake in his study, poring over old legal texts of his own, searching for any precedent within his own kingdom's history that might strengthen their position, should Damien's council ultimately decide to press the claim publicly. "You should rest," Elena said gently, echoing the same advice Cassia had once given her brother, though neither of them knew this quiet symmetry existed between their two separate, parallel struggles. "I cannot rest while our future remains uncertain," Alaric admitted, setting aside the heavy volume he had been studying. "I have built too much with you, Clara, to simply hope the situation resolves itself without preparation." "Then let us prepare together," Elena said, settling into the chair beside him. "Whatever ancient law suggests, whatever ambiguous claims Damien's advisors might construct, we will meet them with equal preparation and equal resolve. I did not survive a frozen forest and rebuild an entire life, simply to lose it now, to a bond I never asked for and never chose." They spent the remaining hours before dawn reviewing every possible legal and political argument, strengthening their position not through fear, but through the same deliberate partnership that had defined their entire relationship from its earliest beginnings. The formal announcement came without warning during the summit's third day, disrupting what had been scheduled as a routine session on regional trade agreements. Damien's chief advisor rose before the assembled delegates, requesting formal recognition to address a matter of pact law affecting one of the attending rulers. Elena felt her stomach drop the moment she heard the request, understanding immediately what was about to unfold before a single word of explanation had been offered. "Alpha King Damien Cross wishes to formally acknowledge, before this assembled council of regional rulers, the existence of an unbroken fated bond between himself and Queen Clara of this territory," the advisor announced, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall. "Under ancient pact tradition, such bonds carry legal standing that predates other marriage arrangements, regardless of circumstances under which those arrangements were formed." Gasps rippled through the gathered delegates, dozens of rulers and their advisors turning to stare at Elena with expressions ranging from shock to fascinated curiosity. She felt Alaric's hand find hers beneath the table, steady and reassuring despite the storm suddenly breaking around them. "This claim has no standing within my territory," Alaric said firmly, rising to address the hall directly. "Queen Clara's marriage to me was conducted according to the laws and traditions of this kingdom, laws that do not recognize Wolfpack tradition as superseding our own legal framework." "With respect," Damien's advisor responded, "the fated bond exists regardless of which kingdom's laws govern the marriage ceremony itself. Ancient tradition suggests that when a fated bond reawakens through direct proximity, as has clearly occurred during this summit, the bonded pair retains certain rights and obligations toward each other that transcend other arrangements." The hall erupted into murmured conversation, delegates from various territories debating quietly among themselves about the legal and political implications of such a claim. Elena felt the weight of every gaze in the room, understanding that this moment would define not just her personal future, but potentially the political standing of both kingdoms involved. She rose from her seat before Alaric could respond further, her own voice carrying clearly through the hall despite the storm of emotion raging beneath her composed exterior. "I would like to address this claim directly," she said, "as the person whose choice is apparently being debated as though I have no voice in the matter." The hall fell silent, every eye now fixed on her as she stepped forward to address the assembled rulers directly. "3 years ago, I fled an engagement to Alpha King Damien Cross," she said, her voice steady despite the personal nature of the revelation she was about to share publicly. "I fled not from fear of the bond between us, but from discovering that my future husband viewed our fated connection as a convenient tool for securing military alliance rather than a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and honest love." She paused, meeting Damien's eyes directly across the hall, watching him absorb the public nature of this confession without flinching from the discomfort it clearly caused him. "I built an entirely new life in the years since that night," she continued. Not through fate, not through any bond assigned before I was old enough to understand what such a bond truly required, but through my own deliberate choices. I earned this crown through years of genuine service to this kingdom's people. I chose my husband freely, understanding completely his character through years of consistent honesty and partnership, rather than accepting a bond that offered no such consistent proof of genuine devotion. She turned to address the assembled rulers more broadly, her voice gaining strength and conviction as she continued. Ancient tradition may recognize fated bonds as carrying certain rights, she said, but I would ask this assembled council to consider a more fundamental question. Should any tradition, however ancient, override the basic right of a person to choose their own future, based on genuine trust, rather than circumstances imposed before they had any voice in the matter? Murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the hall, several rulers nodding thoughtfully at her argument, though others remained visibly uncertain, caught between respect for ancient tradition and the clear injustice of overriding someone's deliberate choice through claims of predetermined fate. I do not deny that a bond exists between myself and Alpha King Cross, Elena continued, forcing herself to speak this uncomfortable truth publicly, rather than allow ambiguity to weaken her position. I felt it reawaken the moment I saw him again during this summit's opening gathering, but feeling a bond exists is not the same as accepting that bond as superior to years of genuine partnership, genuine trust, and genuine love, built through deliberate choice rather than circumstance. She turned back to face Damien directly, her expression fierce with the same determination that had once carried her through a frozen forest rather than accept a life built on betrayal. I choose Alaric, she said firmly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. Not because fate demands it, but because I have built an entire life alongside him through years of honest partnership. I choose the crown I earned through genuine service, not the crown offered as a strategic bargaining chip before I ever had the chance to prove my own worth beyond simple bloodline and convenient alliance. Damien rose slowly from his seat, the weight of her public declaration clearly affecting him deeply, his expression shifting through several emotions before settling into something that looked remarkably like genuine acceptance mixed with regret. I withdraw the claim, he said finally, his voice carrying through the hall with quiet dignity, despite the public nature of his retreat. My advisor spoke on my behalf without fully understanding my own reservations about pursuing this path. Elena, Clara, whatever name you carry now, you have made your choice clear, both in private conversation and now before this entire assembly. I will not dishonor that choice by continuing to press a claim you have so thoroughly and publicly rejected. He turned to address the assembled rulers directly. I apologize for the disruption this matter has caused to our summit's proceedings. Ancient tradition may grant certain legal standing to fated bonds, but I have learned, through painful and public experience, that some things matter more than tradition. Genuine choice, freely made and consistently honored, deserves respect regardless of what other claims might theoretically exist. The hall remained quiet for a long moment following his declaration, delegates absorbing the full weight of what had just transpired, before Alaric rose to formally accept Damien's withdrawal. I appreciate your wisdom in recognizing this truth, Alaric said, extending a measure of genuine respect toward the man who had, moments before, threatened everything he and Elena had built together. Queen Clara's choice has never wavered throughout this entire situation. I am grateful you have chosen to honor that choice, rather than continuing to contest it. As the formal session concluded and delegates began dispersing to discuss the dramatic events they had just witnessed, Elena felt Alaric's hand find hers once again beneath the table, squeezing gently in silent acknowledgement of the strength it had taken to defend their partnership so publicly and directly. She did not yet know that this public declaration, though it had resolved the immediate legal threat to her marriage, would not be the final confrontation required before she could fully close the chapter of her life that Damien represented. One final conversation remained, private and personal rather than public and legal, before she could truly move forward with complete peace regarding the past she had worked so hard to overcome. News of the dramatic council session spread quickly beyond the summit itself, carried by delegates returning to their own territories with vivid accounts of the queen who had stood before an entire assembly of rulers and declared her own choice louder than any ancient tradition could claim. Within weeks, the story had transformed into something of a legend among the common people of several neighboring kingdoms, retold in marketplaces and taverns as proof that even the oldest customs could yield to genuine courage and honest conviction. Grace, the widow from the eastern village whose family Elena had once personally insured, received aid during the fever crisis, heard the story from a traveling merchant, and wept with pride upon learning what her queen had endured and overcome before such a powerful audience. She has always fought for what is right, Grace told her children that evening, even when the fight is her own to bear alone. Back at the summit, the immediate aftermath of the council session left Elena drained but resolute, grateful for Alaric's steady presence beside her throughout the ordeal. The remaining delegates, many of whom had arrived viewing the gathering as simple routine diplomacy, now regarded their host kingdom's queen with a mixture of awe and genuine respect that would carry lasting benefit to every future negotiation her kingdom conducted. Yet even with the legal threat resolved so decisively, Elena recognized that a deeper, more personal reckoning still remained unfinished. A final honest exchange that owed nothing to politics or ancient law, but simply to the two people who had once loved each other imperfectly, and now needed to release that history completely. Damien requested one final private conversation before departing the summit, and this time Elena agreed without hesitation, understanding that genuine closure required one last honest exchange between them, free from the public pressure that had defined their previous encounters during this eventful gathering. They met again in the eastern garden, though this time Alaric stood a respectful distance away near the entrance, present but not intruding, his quiet support giving Elena the confidence to face this final conversation, without the defensive guardedness that had colored their earlier exchanges. "I owe you a genuine apology," Damien said, his voice carrying none of the desperate hope that had characterized their previous garden conversation, replaced instead by something calmer and more settled. "Not simply for the original betrayal that drove you away, but for allowing my advisors to nearly convince me toward pursuing that legal claim. I let old habits of political calculation nearly override the genuine respect I claim to hold for your choice." "But you withdrew the claim," Elena said, publicly, decisively, before it could cause lasting damage. "That matters, Damien. Growth is not measured by never stumbling, but by how quickly one corrects course when stumbling occurs. Cassia helped me see clearly," Damien admitted. "As did watching you defend your choice so powerfully before that entire assembly. I realized, watching you speak, that the woman standing before that council was someone entirely transformed from the frightened bride who once fled our engagement in the middle of the night. You built something remarkable, Elena, something I could never have offered you, not as the man I was 3 years ago." Elena felt the last remnants of old anger finally settling into something calmer, something closer to genuine peace. "Thank you for recognizing that," she said. "And thank you, genuinely, for ultimately choosing to respect my choice, rather than continuing to fight against it." "What will you tell your people about today's events?" Damien asked, curiosity evident in his tone. "The truth," Elena said simply. "That ancient tradition attempted to claim authority over my personal choice, and that choice prevailed regardless of tradition's claims. I believe that message matters, Damien, not just for my own kingdom, but for every young woman who might someday face similar pressure to accept fate over genuine partnership." Damien nodded slowly, absorbing this perspective with evident respect. "I believe you are right," he said, "and I believe, strange as it may sound given our history, that I am grateful this bond brought us back into contact, even briefly, even under such complicated circumstances. It allowed me to finally understand fully what I lost, and more importantly, it allowed me to witness the remarkable person you became despite, or perhaps because of, the pain I once caused." "What will you do now?" Elena asked, genuine curiosity replacing the defensive caution that had characterized their earlier exchanges. "Return home," Damien said. "Rule my kingdom with the lessons these past 3 years have taught me. Perhaps, eventually, consider marriage again, though this time built on genuine partnership rather than strategic calculation. You taught me that lesson, Elena, even if the teaching cost us both considerable pain along the way. I hope you find that genuine partnership," Elena said, and she meant it completely, the last traces of bitterness finally dissolving into simple, honest goodwill. "You deserve happiness too, Damien, built the right way this time." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, 3 years of complicated history finally settling into something resembling peaceful closure, before Damien extended his hand formally. "Farewell, Queen Clara," he said, using her chosen name with genuine respect rather than the desperate familiarity that had characterized his earlier attempts to reclaim what he had lost. "May your reign continue to bring the same prosperity and genuine care you have already shown this kingdom's people." "Farewell, Alpha King Cross," Elena replied, shaking his hand with equal formality and genuine warmth. "May you find, in your own time, the same peace and partnership I have been fortunate enough to discover here." He departed the garden without further words, walking back toward the main castle, where his own delegation waited to begin their journey home, and Elena watched him go with a lightness in her chest that had been absent for 3 long years, the final weight of unresolved history finally lifting away entirely. Alaric approached once Damien had disappeared from view, wrapping his arms gently around her from behind, resting his chin lightly against her shoulder. "How do you feel?" he asked quietly. "Free," Elena said, leaning back into his embrace with genuine contentment. "Truly free, for the first time since that terrible night I ran into the forest. The bond still exists. I suppose it always will in some form, but it no longer holds any power over my choices. I chose you then, Alaric, and I choose you now, completely and without reservation." "The council will likely wish to discuss today's dramatic proceedings at considerable length," Alaric said, a note of gentle humor creeping into his voice. "I suspect our summit will be remembered for considerably more than simple trade negotiations." Elena laughed, genuine and unrestrained, the sound carrying easily through the quiet garden. "Let them discuss it," she said. "Let every ruler in this region understand clearly that crowns earned through genuine partnership and honest choice will always outlast crowns offered as strategic bargaining chips or claimed through ancient tradition alone." The summit concluded 3 days later, its formal trade agreements ultimately overshadowed by the dramatic personal drama that had unfolded within its proceedings, though the actual business conducted proved genuinely beneficial for every territory involved, strengthening regional cooperation for years to come. Elena and Alaric's kingdom continued flourishing in the years that followed, their partnership deepening through continued shared governance, their reputation as fair and genuinely devoted rulers spreading throughout the entire region. The story of the queen who had publicly rejected an ancient fated bond in favor of chosen partnership became something of a legend among neighboring territories, inspiring countless conversations about the nature of genuine choice versus predetermined destiny. Damien, true to the growth he had demonstrated during those final garden conversations, returned to his own kingdom, transformed by everything he had witnessed and learned. Years later, word would reach Elena's court that he had indeed found genuine partnership with a woman from within his own territory, someone chosen through honest courtship rather than strategic calculation, someone who helped him build the kind of consistent, trustworthy leadership that Elena herself had once hoped to find in him during their original engagement. Elena thought of him occasionally, without bitterness, simply as a chapter of her history that had ultimately led her toward the genuine happiness she now enjoyed. The betrayal that had once shattered her world completely had, through years of difficult but genuine growth, led her toward a crown worn not as burden or obligation, but as the earned symbol of a life built entirely through her own deliberate, courageous choices. She had disappeared into a frozen forest as a broken, betrayed young woman fleeing a future she never wanted. She emerged, years later, as a queen who understood completely the difference between fate and choice, between obligation and genuine love, between a crown given as strategic bargaining chip and a crown earned through years of authentic partnership and devoted service. And that crown, freely chosen and genuinely earned, remained firmly and permanently hers, regardless of whatever ancient bonds or ancient traditions might attempt to claim otherwise. Seasons continued to turn, and the kingdom Elena had once stumbled into as a frozen, nameless stranger flourished under her steady partnership with Alaric, their reputation for fairness and genuine devotion spreading throughout every allied territory in the region. New treaties formed on the foundation of trust the two of them had built together, and young rulers from neighboring lands often sought Elena's counsel specifically, drawn by her reputation for balancing compassion with practical wisdom in equal measure. Grace's children grew alongside the kingdom's renewed prosperity, the eldest eventually earning a position within the very council seat Elena had established to give smaller villages a lasting voice in matters of governance. Margaret, the healer who had first tended Elena's frostbitten hand so many years before, lived long enough to see the frightened stranger she once comforted become a queen celebrated far beyond her own kingdom's borders, and she never once revealed the private details of those early days, honoring the trust Elena had placed in her from the very beginning. Cassia visited the kingdom years later, invited as part of a formal diplomatic exchange between the two territories, and finally met the woman her brother had once loved and lost, now standing confidently as queen beside a husband who clearly adored her. The two women spoke privately during that visit, and Cassia left with genuine respect for the transformation she witnessed, understanding fully why her brother had ultimately chosen to release his claim rather than continue fighting against a fate that Elena herself had already resolved. Elena thought back sometimes to that terrifying night she had fled through the frozen forest, certain she was losing everything that mattered. She understood now, with the clarity that only years of hard-won peace could provide, that she had not lost everything that night. She had simply cleared the way for everything that truly mattered, to finally find her instead. The crown she wore was never about the medal or the jewels resting upon her head. It was about every difficult choice that had led her to this moment, every scar transformed into strength, every betrayal that had ultimately taught her the true weight and value of genuine, freely given love. She had disappeared once, broken and betrayed, into a forest that offered her nothing but cold and uncertainty. She had emerged, in the fullness of time, as exactly the woman she was always meant to become, wearing a crown that belonged to her completely, chosen freely, and worn with unshakable, well-earned peace.